Hello and welcome to Rights and Recourse, a program that tackles constitutional, human rights and legal issues, bringing you information and analysis. My name is Dumila Mateza. Remember, you can also be part of our discussion by calling our studio line on 011 714 5497 or 5498, or tweet us at Rights and Recourse. Alternatively, email your thoughts about this program and many others to rightsandrecourse@sabc.co.za. A constitutional democracy means that the supreme power in a democracy is vested in the people. They vote in regularly held elections to decide which political party from two or more opposing ones shall lead the government. A government in which the people elect their leaders can also be called a republic. The elected government must act within the laws and safeguards of a constitution, which defines the powers of the government and protects the rights of individuals, rights that are enshrined in the constitution, which is the supreme law of the land. Constitutionalism, defined minimally, alludes to the principle that the exercise of political power shall be bounded by rules that determine the validity of legislative and executive action. Is the government of Zimbabwe a pretense of constitutionalism? Today on Rights and Recourse, we will try and respond to this question and many others regarding constitutionalism in Zimbabwe. To discuss today's topic, we are joined in the studio by Mr. Tamuka Chirimambowa from the Institute of Public Affairs in Zimbabwe, Mr. Dewa Mavinga from the Southern African Director of the Human Rights Watch, and Mr. Stanley Karombo, an independent analyst. Gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Thank you.
My first question is, probably I should ask you, Dewa, how does the constitution adopted at the Lancaster House Agreement during the independence of Zimbabwe compare to the present constitution?
I would say there are similarities in the sense that executive power is concentrated in the office of the president. So there hasn't been significant change in that regard. Also, the Lancaster House Constitution is a Bill of Rights. So does the 2013 Constitution. So there are many similarities, but in Zimbabwe, the challenge is more to do with implementation of constitutional values and not necessarily what is on paper, because you could actually compare in terms of what is provided for the values and principles in the Lancaster House Constitution and the 2013 Constitution, but the challenge is the practice. Constitutional practice is not there in Zimbabwe.
Mr. Chirimambowa, the question I want to know, when you put together, we're talking there about constitutionalism when we opened the program, and also a constitutional democracy. In a constitutional democracy like you have in South Africa, you have institutions that are supporting the constitution. For instance, the Lancaster House Agreement made provision for what was called an ombudsman, which is what we have as a public protector here. And it is also, somebody said to me, it's only when the people of that country understand that the constitution protects them, and also when the judiciary in the country doesn't believe that they've been appointed by the president, so they have to do what the president wants them to do.
Yeah, certainly I think your observations are quite right, but what you have to observe is that in Zimbabwe, when you look at the institutions, you have never had a separation between the ruling party and the institutions that existed within the different arms of the state. So basically that's what you meant. What you actually have in Zimbabwe is not necessarily a constitutional republic or a modern state which you find in other like South Africa, but what you have is a party state.
The other thing, Mr. I'm just trying to remember your name now, Karombo, Mr. Karombo, the issues referred to here, you find when Chief Justice Dumbuchena was there, Chief Justice Dumbuchena did point out that we are likely going to have a problem because there's no difference between party and state.
I tend to agree with you to some extent, but the thing is, I think there is separation of powers to some extent, because if you look at a good example, the appointment of people who are running the elections, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, it was not the ZANU-PF per se that appointed those people. So to me, if it was not ZANU-PF as a party, as a ruling party that appointed those people, that means there's a separation of power.
Now, what I actually mean here is in running the country, the affairs of the state, is that there is no difference, there's very little difference between the party and the government. That's what I mean. You can't make a distance. The ZANU-PF doesn't make a difference between them and the government.
Yeah, I agree with you to some extent, but also to some extent I don't agree with you, because ZANU-PF, when it is doing some of these campaigns, a good example, they categorically say that this is ZANU-PF party doing a rally or a political rally, I think, and when it's things that has to do with the government, they do also separate that. This is government issues.
You want to come in, you can come in,
yes,
anyone can come in anytime.
And on that point, I want to say that you're quite correct that Zimbabwe is a case of a very clever way of imitating a democracy or a constitutionalism. It's what I could call what is called isomorphic mimicry, where an animal can pretend to be another to survive in the jungle. So ZANU-PF is pretending to set up institutions that appear democratic. So if you look at the judiciary, but when you look at the individuals, those are people who are beholden to ZANU-PF and to President Mugabe, and who are loyal to Mugabe. And this is actually what openly, initially, ZANU-PF in 1980, Mugabe's prime minister then, it actually said his mission is to make Zimbabwe an official one-party state. But it was resisted by his comrades within ZANU-PF, including the then Secretary General Edgar Tekere. And then, so they abandoned the official structure. But de facto, you have a one-party state in the sense that there is no difference between the state and the party. So this is why in Zimbabwe, you would find that the generals in the army can openly say they support ZANU-PF, and they would attack anyone who votes for the opposition in public and get away with it, because Mugabe knows that he has put his people in key places in the army, in the police, in the central intelligence operatives. And not only that, when it comes to the control of state resources, ZANU-PF can actually tap into state resources, into parastatal private companies, government companies, controlled companies, to fund the party. So ZANU-PF is a shell as a political party, which is siphoning and surviving on the basis of being intricately linked to the state. And this is really the tragedy that we have, because when you have that, it means that you can then not separate. On paper, yes, you can separate, but in reality, those individuals are beholden to Mugabe and to ZANU-PF. This is why we cannot have a progressive democratic structure in the country.
No, Mr. Dewa, what you should, I think you might have forgotten to tell the viewers is that, especially when the appointment of the recent judge, it was done publicly, and everyone knows that, the judge who is now here was not appointed by the president, but everybody participated in the appointment of the president. It's clear,
you want to come in, Mr. Chilmangoa.
I think what we have to look at here, the issue is not to look at, when we are looking at whether Zimbabwe is a constitutional democracy, is it a republic or is it a party state, we need to look at the general governing practices. What is the dominant governing practices? Certainly, as Mr. Karombo says, the appointment of Chief Justice Malaba, it was done through parliament, interviews, people participated, which is why kudos to that process. But I think also what he needs to tell the viewers is the underhand dealings that were around, that where even people try to stop that process.
Yes.
And in particular, that was where the current vice president, who also doubles as the Minister of Justice, Minister Emerson Mnangagwa, had to sponsor a bill in Parliament, and they even had to go to court through proxies. One person called Romeo Zban, where they tried to stop a constitutional process on the basis that the executive wants to change the constitution, which is unheard of. But nevertheless, what we need to look at, I do agree, Zimbabwe has got its moments where you see the law working, sometimes institutions working. But when you put it on a continuum or on a scale, to say when you want to weigh this on an average point, what is the dominant mode of governance? This is when you see that the dominant mode of governance does not articulate or get anywhere near to a constitutional democracy. Or it cannot be as here as in South Africa, where you see institutions actually working and even making the executive to account, which you don't get in Zimbabwe.
But you do have political parties, opposition political parties, and they are very active.
No, we do have opposition political parties, and they are active, yes, but you also have to look at the environment, and the opposition it didn't start. Let's look at actually even from 1980, when we had ZANU-PF winning, I mean, when it dominated ZANU, and then it was followed by ZAPU. What happened when ZAPU was in opposition? Let's look at ZANU-Ndonga. What happened to its supporters and its institutions?
I looked at a speech by Dr. Joshua Nkomo at the Lancaster House conference, which he delivered because he was leading the delegation that had Mugabe in it. And he was asking the question, is Zimbabwe going to be rid of tribalism? And it would seem to me that has not started.
Certainly, the issue of tribalism in Zimbabwe remains unresolved in the sense that there are, horrific human rights abuses that have been committed by security and state forces. The 5th Brigade, a crack army unit, loyal only to then Prime Minister Mugabe, which committed atrocities in Matebeleland between 1981 and 1983. And these atrocities have not been accounted for. Individuals responsible for these crimes have not been brought to justice. There was an attempt at some point to have a judiciary inquiry into those disturbances, but the results of that inquiry have not been made public. The recommendations have not been implemented. So it's a huge challenge that needs to be resolved. And just to go back to Mr. Chimambo and Karomba here, to say that, in fact, the example that you raise about the appointment recently of the Chief Justice actually shows that there is no respect for the rule of law, in the sense that immediately after that appointment, the executive went and amended the Constitution. The first amendment to this new Constitution is actually to remove the power of Parliament to appoint the Chief Justice and his two deputies.
Place in the hands of the
president. Yes. But so now it is actually President Mugabe who appoints the Chief Justice and his deputies, and not Parliament.
Let's give Karomba a chance. Mr. Karomba.
I think maybe if you look even the Constitution, it indirectly gives the power to the president to appoint. Why I'm saying that is this. If the interviews were done, right, the people will give those names, could be 3 if I'm not mistaken, to President Mugabe. And President Mugabe is the one who was supposed to say...
You mean, let me correct you, let me help you. You mean the Judicial Services Commission does the interviews, yes, and hand over the names of the people to the president.
They will recommend, we have these candidates, and it was the prerogative of the president to say, now with those selected, I will take this one. Even before this coming amendment of the Constitution.
But what Deo is saying here is saying that provision has been removed now. The president will, on his own, decide, I want Mr. Chirimamboa to be the Chief Justice.
To me, it's the one and the same thing. It's the one and the same thing. It's just technicality. Even prior to that, if we say before this amendment, they're talking of President Mugabe had the power to elect, despite the fact that they would have selected those people. Mugabe would say, I would need this one. So it's the same, it's the one and same thing.
But the one thing we should give to the Zimbabweans, Mr. Chirimamboa, is the fact that their political parties on the opposition side are not based on tribal lines. If I remember correctly, Morgan Changurai is Shona, Mujuru is Shona. They are not based on, unless you are saying to me, the people who are following Welshman Ngube are all from Matebeleland.
No, I wouldn't say the people who are following Welshman Ngube are all from Matebeleland. I think that would be a misnomer. And also to say all the people who are following Morgan are misnomer. But one thing which I can say is within our politics as a country, we do have a problem. The issue of tribe and ethnicity is something which we cannot, just sweep under the carpet and try to bury our heads in the sense. issues of tribe do exist, and there are nuances and innuendos here and there, both within the ruling party and also as well as within the opposition, where we've got these moments where this ugly head of tribalism or ethnicity rears its head. And I think this goes back to the fact that the issue of tribe or ethnicity has not been really unpacked in Zimbabwe, and it's not only in Zimbabwe, even in Africa. It's just
even here in South Africa.
Even here in South Africa, because when I look at this whole issues of tribe or an authentic, these are all fake, based on fake histories and fake analogies, which are not actually embedded in proper or grounded on proper facts, which can say, okay, here is a pure Zezuru, here is a pure Karanga, here is a pure Shona. I mean, it's all a fallacy.
Dewa, there's something I have noticed, we have noticed across Africa, which is a trend, where opposition parties come together and they form these super coalitions. We've seen it in Kenya, we've seen it in Zambia, and we are now seeing it in Zimbabwe. Is it going to work?
For Zimbabwe, it might not work in the sense that it is not a genuine super coalition that is coming together so far. If they come together as a super coalition, it might work, because if you look at these revolutionary parties like ZANU-PF, which have got access to state resources, they really need a formidable opposition to get them out of power, because they are also controlling the electoral management body, the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. So you would need all people to come together, but so far we have not seen that coalition forming in Zimbabwe. We have seen an alliance of the different parts of the MDC, led by Changre, that had split, that appears to be coming together. But in that structure, you still have Joyce Mujuru and her team outside of that framework. ZAPU does not appear to be on board. So it would...
Is ZAPU still around?
It is in some shape or another, but it's struggling, but it certainly is around. So there are different political parties. There are also new movements, like Dr. Ngosana Moyo's Alliance for the People's Agenda, APA, which has emerged. We also have Transform Zimbabwe. So, but we need to see a real, genuine coalition. What we have now is an MDC alliance, which is not broad enough.
If you'd like to join us in today's discussion, you can call us on 011 714 5497 or 5498. When we come back, we'll talk about the constitution that was drafted by civil society in Zimbabwe and what happened to that constitution. Stay with us.
Are your eyes in all major events around the world?
A wonder not seen in the United States in almost 100 years.
It looks like the sky of a different world. You see the stars out during the day. You see a sunset 360 degrees all around you.
Before you leave, make sure that Dropburn is taking you through traffic alerts all around South Africa.
All we can do is stick to what we do and focus on our own job and not focus on them.
The Boks will also don the red jersey in this match to mark the 25th anniversary of rugby unity in South Africa.
An update on all major currency to guide you. A story of women in jail told in pictures by Fatima Mir through art that will blow your mind. Set the agenda for the day with Morning Live.
Welcome back to Rights and Recourse as we discuss the situation of democracy in Zimbabwe. In his book, Farm Invasions in Zimbabwe, Luke Zunga quotes Chief Justice Enoch Dumbuchena and say, we have a president that does not believe in the rule of law, who disregards the tendency upon which the rule of law is built. And it would seem to me this is what is happening throughout Zimbabwe. throughout these years that President Mugabe has been there? Or you waited until after they've changed the constitution, the Lancaster House constitution?
I think that quotation from Chief Justice Dumbuchena by Luke Zunga is actually spot on. President Mugabe never believed in the rule of law. He's not a man bound by the rule of law. Even when you look at his rise within ZANU, how he actually got that, even if you want to check his rise within ZANU, it was not on the basis of the ZANU constitution, even how he deposed Ndabaningi Stole from the presidents and he had to take over. I mean, he had the support in particular where he mobilized the military and plotted a coup where he removed his president when he was the SG. But you also look at even after independence, the only thing which happened is that what made President Mugabe thrive, it was much more to do with the global politics of then, the geopolitics of the Cold War. To say that he successfully managed to play his cards and actually allied himself with the British and the West. And some of these things have actually become public, particularly when you look at the researches which have been going on around the disturbances in Matabeleland, which the British and the Americans knew. But because of realpolitik, they needed Mugabe by then because there was apartheid South Africa to deal with, and they saw Zimbabwe as an interlocutor within Southern Africa. And to avoid President Mugabe moving, to the communist side, which was seen as not good. So President Mugabe has never really worked on the law, because when you look at what happened in Matabeleland, it shows it was not a person who believes in the law, but who believes in brute force. He's more of a Hobbesian person. He believes in Hobbes' anarchic society where man is ruled by force, not by ideas or laws.
For some strange reason, Dewa, the Zimbabwe had, especially President Mugabe, had this connection with North Korea. And I think listening to him at the UN last week, where he attacked President Trump, he still has this arrangement. How strong is this relationship with North Korea?
But before there were texts in, I think we cannot overly say Mugabe doesn't believe in the rule of law or the constitution, because since 1980, Zimbabwe has never failed to run an election.
But running elections doesn't mean there's democracy.
Right. But it's part of it, right? What I'm saying is, Zimbabwe has never failed to run an election, even single year, when the time of running election is due. Then secondly, on the issue of Matabeleland, I admit strongly that yes, the dispatch of the 5th Brigade into Manicaland was uncalled for. But what also people should take cognizance of is the fact that the situation in Matabeleland was very unattainable, and there was disturbances. Tourists were killed during that time in Matabeleland.
Let's hear this relationship with North Korea.
Well, yes. So Mugabe from the outset had a very strong relationship with North Korea. In fact, he had North Koreans train a crack army unit in Zimbabwe, in Manicaland, the 5th Brigade, which was then unleashed on Matabeleland. So that was the basis. It was a military relationship, very close. Also, the North Koreans donated the Heroes Eka architecture where they were building, where Mugabe now buries his heroes from ZANU-PF. So that relationship has continued over the years to this date. So you would find that they've remained very close, and Mugabe is loyal to the North Koreans and thankful that they supplied him with the military expertise to have this secret army that he deployed as and when he wished to deal with political opponents, not just the so-called dissidents issues in Matabeleland, but also precisely to crush ZAPU and deal decisively with a political opponent that happened to be in the minority Ndebele tribe.
I want to go to a question you raised, around elections. The 2002 elections were seen as an election that was stolen from MDC, and Morgan Tsvangirai claimed that the South African government was complicit despite the fact that President Thabo Mbeki appointed 2 South African judges to investigate the validity of the elections. In other words, what I'm trying to say, elections do not necessarily, holding elections every 5 years does not necessarily mean democracy.
Yeah, but if you look also into the opposition Zim, you hardly think that there is any opposition because right now there is no opposition to talk of. They are very disorganized. They are very, very disorganized to the extent that even besides the 2000 election, the 2002 election, the 2013 election, former MDC Secretary General admitted publicly that they were not organized. And the BT admitted that ZANU-PF did very well. He admitted publicly.
In the same way, where it would appear that the strength of ZANU-PF is in the rural areas. But you have rural areas are sparsely populated. Therefore, you can't say all that support for ZAPU from ZANU-PF comes from rural areas.
Yeah. I think it's a myth to say ZANU-PF is very strong in the rural areas. And I think this speaks to the issues which Dewa has raised before, the issues of the rule of law, which my colleague here is trying to shy away from. I mean, we do agree that the opposition is not a saint in Zimbabwe. I mean, it's not an issue of debate that the opposition has got its own weaknesses. But then the question is, we have got deaths which are linked to elections. We have got rape cases linked to elections. And these issues, there isn't any election which you can talk of in Zimbabwe right now. Right from 1980, you can talk of the case of Patrick Kombai when Zoom came in 1991. When he was shot, there was an attempt at his life. And that person who attempted to kill Kombai is lying at the National Heroes Acre, one who was convicted for attempted murder. Despite that, Kombai is a former nationalist and a liberation war hero.
So you remind me of something when you say that person who there's a gentleman whose statue is standing in the yards of the Parliament in London who killed the king.
Yeah, that's the irony.
One of the other things I want us to talk about is the economy. Luke Zunga says in his book, when the Zimbabwe got independence, at the negotiating table, there were no people who understood the economics, how Zimbabwe would go for in building and in their economy. Is that a problem? I don't find it in the speech by Bishop Muzorewa at the Lancaster House. I don't find it in the speech by Joshua Nkomo, and I don't find it anywhere where there's talk of the economy of the country.
Yeah. What I can say, I think that is very spot on. Nobody understood what is an economy, and it's not only Zimbabwe. Most of these African countries, few of our leaders do understand what an economy is, because the reason why I say is this: when you look at most of our leaders in terms of their policy orientation, look, when our business leaders travel to go and negotiate trade deals or on investment missions, they don't go with their business. But if you look, if it's either President Trump or somebody maybe like from Europe, they move with their business delegation. They are quite clear.
President Zuma does move with business when he goes.
I mean, if President Zuma does it, I think that is credit to him. But what I want to highlight is in most of these countries, even in Zimbabwe, you find that the president moves with his extended family, and the entourage is about the extended family, the close confidants, and the politicians. But when you look, ask yourself, even at Lancaster, what blueprint was being presented? So we focus more on the political kingdom, not the economic. This is why up to now I still talk about black economic empowerment, radical economic transformation, indigenization, because we were oblivious to these questions.
That's a question I was actually surprised. I know you wanted to come in, Denga, but I want Mr. Karombo to just come in here. What concerns me really in this issue of the economics, you find that the ZANU-PF government, the Zimbabwean government, has not spelled out in any of their document how they want to grow the economy. There was this issue of socialism, and I don't know what socialism is.
I think that was a travesty in the first place when these nationalists came out from the war, and because these guys, they did not go to school by that time. So when they came from the war, basically what they wanted to do was to have political power than anything else. And typically, especially also in Zim, the issue of land was not an issue until when the ZANU-PF maybe find that their political space was being taken, right? And well, they took advantage of what was happening by that time, and then they let the war
German like Simba Makoni.
Simba.
Well, I think the challenge with Zimbabwe, and Tamuka correctly said, there was never really a commitment to looking at the economics. So today, if you look at the cabinet meetings by ZANU-PF government or the Politburo meeting at party level, they can go on until 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. But what are they discussing? Factionalism, positioning, the politics, and not the economics. So that's the big problem. And yes, the issue of land only became an issue because politically they were losing ground and they wanted a slogan, something that could whip up the emotions of Zimbabweans, and which they could then say, we are now giving you land, so give us political power back. So we continue to have this problem. The land issue has not been resolved precisely because it was only there to hoodwink people to believe that there is a commitment. People like Simba Makoni is a technocrat. You know that in 2001, Dr. Ngosana Moyo had to abandon and resign from the cabinet because he realized that technocrats had no space in ZANU-PF. It was a space for people who are loyal to ZANU-PF. So you don't say what works, okay? You say what wins you favor with the leadership. So Mugabe would then dismiss those people like Simba Makoni as being bookish, because he wanted people who were pragmatic and practical in terms of retention of political power,
to some extent,
not the economics.
To some extent, these technocrats also are bookish, because if you look, we had Dr. Chidzero, right? Also a well-renowned economist, so to speak. Then he fell to the IMF when the IMF said they wanted a structural adjustment program. I think that was the time when the Zimbabwean economy started to go to bust. If you look up after 5 years of the economic structural adjustment, the Zim dollar was devalued more than 50%.
There's an old saying in English that says, he who pays the piper calls the tune. So if you are going to go to the IMF and ask for a loan, the IMF surely will say, this is how we want you to use our money. This happened also during the 1998 conference on land, where there were donors. The donors said, this is how the money should be used, and the government of Zimbabwe abandoned that process.
Absolutely, yeah. and they also misused the funds that they'd been given for the land process. So there was no accountability. So it could not happen that the government of Zimbabwe on one hand would say, give us the money, but don't ask for accountability. So it had to go hand in hand. And in fact, these were policies adopted by the Mugabe government at that particular point in time. So yes, we must squarely blame President Mugabe's regime for adopting ruinous economic policies which did not really address the fundamentals of how to take Zimbabwe forward, and we are still in that same problem. And unfortunately, we cannot move out of this space because ZANU-PF has captured all state institutions.
I think when we speak, let's speak about the government of Zimbabwe rather than ZANU-PF.
Well, yes, it's the ZANU-PF government. Yes.
The other thing I wanted to talk about, Mr. Chirumamboa, is the issue of the confusion within the ZANU-PF party. You spoke earlier of factions. Yeah. What could this confusion mean, coupled to it, the splits that we have seen, and also we've seen some military veterans now saying they are not going to support President Mugabe, and they have split into different ways.
I wouldn't want to use the word split for ZANU-PF, precisely for the reason that Joyce Mjuru did not split from ZANU-PF, and they were expelled. Chris Mtangwa and the war veterans were expelled from the party. They didn't split. And even when you listen to their current talk right now, they still show affinity to go back home, to go back to ZANU-PF. So I wouldn't say it was split. But what I can say about all these rumblings which you find in ZANU-PF is the mistaken belief by those who are opposed to President Mugabe's continued stay in power that he will one day leave power. Zobo made that mistake and he went. And so Mutsangwa and his group are also making the same mistake of blaming Grace, G40, not realizing the real G40 in Zimbabwe is President Mugabe, because he rules by proxy. He plays them. These are like pawns on his chessboard, which are easily dispensable at any time he so wishes. So if you really want to challenge the issue of factionalism, you have to take President Mugabe head on.
Let's take, I'm told there's a caller on the line. Good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Yes, how are you, Ndade Dumile, and your guest?
Fine, thanks. How are you, sir?
Okay. Ndade Dumile, if you look at the Zimbabwean situation, of course, the democracy on paper is democracy, but on the ground, that is not the case. If you remember the leader of the opposition party, how many times he was beaten and admitted in hospital, do you call that democracy? And also last week, there were some demonstrations where the media wanted to cover the incident. The media people were beaten. One of the guys is still admitted in hospital. And if you look at SADC, how it's really mum on this, what is really taking place in Zimbabwe, you can clearly see that our leaders don't have interest of the people on the ground. Because what is really taking place in Zimbabwe, democracy is only on paper. Recently in UN, when President Mugabe was there, he was bold to criticize Donald Trump about what is taking place in North Korea. But he's failing to deal with the issues in his own country. What type of democracy is that?
Well, what Mushera is raising there is an issue that I had put a question to. I have seen what's happening, especially in the SADC region, where opposition parties are harassed, they are locked in jail. We saw it happen in Uganda, we saw it happen in Zambia. It hasn't happened in Zimbabwe, but we saw Mr. Changirai being beaten up by the police when he was campaigning. How then do we call that democracy, Mr. Kamboro?
Karombo.
Karombo, I'm sorry, my apologies. I think I must write your name here.
I think the issue of democracy is a bit problematic. How do you define democracy? I think we are defining democracy in the Western way. In the African way...
there's no other way.
No.
There's no other...
How do you define...
There is not a meaning for democracy. Democracy is a government of the people, by the people, for the people.
But even before this word being pushed around mostly by the NGOs, that this issue of democracy, we had our own democracy even before the coming of the white man.
Are you saying Dewa and his organization are pushing the word democracy?
To some extent, yes. To some extent, yes. It's only democracy when things are going on their way, especially when the opposition are winning. That's when they say there's democracy. If the ruling party is not winning, there's no democracy.
I just want us to finalize in this issue of the economy. There's always this thing that it's been pointed out. I think one of the other persons who pointed this thing was President Thabo Mbeki, who said, in the Lancaster Agreement, there was talk of Britain will pay for the redistribution of land. I read this document, the Lancaster document, which is word for word. There is nothing of the sort in that document. They talk about property.
Yeah, I think some of these things, when you look at the issue which you are raising about the economy, certainly I'll touch on Lancaster, you find that when these agreements were raised, we also have to understand the environment in which decolonization was happening. In that, these things were carefully worded. This was most of our leaders were not literate. They didn't know some of these agreements. Because by then, let's also look at Mozambique.
Let's hold our thought there. I'm told there's a call on the line from Gauteng. Good afternoon and welcome to Rights and Recourse.
Hello, sir.
You're fine, thanks. How are you, Norman?
I'm fine. Yeah, I just want to make a few comments. I think the gentleman inside, between those other two gentlemen, really is a ZANU-PF. There is no such a which you can say he's independent, because I don't see he's independent. Because I myself, I was born in Maternement. I know the situation on the ground. And by actually making such comments, I know that I'm even attracting state agencies to actually come on my tail. I'll give you an example from Victoria Falls to Bulawayo. There is not even a single state college that has been built by the ZANU-PF government. And if you go to many areas in Materellement, you will find out that they don't vote ZANU-PF out of love, but out of the fear of intimidation, because so much atrocities have been committed. So many people were actually killed. So if you go in areas like Infuza and Cholocho, where there are older people there, you should tell them that they are actually victimized, and they are told that if you have, if by any way you vote for the opposition and you don't vote for ZANU-PF, the state will come and harass you. There will be a repeat of what actually happened during the 80s. So you should speak about something that is on the ground. Indeed, tribalism is an issue in Zimbabwe. And God, really, we don't really know what actually happened. And as I speak right now, I feel like crying. Churches have actually cried. A lot of men of God have actually cried. They don't even know what to do. Because the truth of the matter is ZANU-PF and Robert Mugabe, those people are really, really ruthless. In as much as you can try to justify it, there's no in which you can justify it. Because even Morgan Tsvangirai himself, to an extent, I think is now a failed project because he doesn't even know what to do.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you, Norman. Thank you, Norman. Thank you, Norman. Thank you. Thank you. Let's give. You heard Norman there saying, Mr. Karombo, that people are not voting for ZANU-PF because they like it. They voted because of fear.
I don't think so. If you look in constitutions like Cholocho, is it north or south, where Professor Moyo is? North. I mean, I think he has done tremendously well, especially if you look like recently where he has been doing, constructing houses for the people who have been affected by the Cyclone El Nino. So there is no way out, even come 2018, those people are not going to vote for him because he's done extremely well in that area.
Now, we've had situations, Mr. Karombo, where even the army has said, if another leader were to win the elections, they will not regard that leader as the commander-in-chief.
I wouldn't think so.
That's what the army said.
No, but to what extent? I mean, what was the context? What was the context?
Hold that thought. I'll come back to you. I just want to take this call from Gauteng. Good afternoon, Emmanuel.
Afternoon, sir. How are you?
Fine, thanks. How are you?
All right. I would like to ask your panelists one question there. There is, after the American government, after seeing the disturbances in Zimbabwe, they passed a law which is known as the Zimbabwe Democracy in Recovery Act, ZIDERA in short. So to the panelists, I would like to know what contribution did that law make to the Zimbabwean political system and the economy? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You heard that question very clear. Probably let's give it to you, Mr. Chiramambao.
Yeah, I think the whole issue of ZIDERA, yes, indeed, the Americans passed ZIDERA, but when they passed the ZIDERA, I think what needs to be looked at, what was the background which led to the passing of the Zimbabwe Democracy Economic Recovery Act. And the question to say what is its contribution to the Zimbabwean economy or to say to the Zimbabwean political system is something which is a subject of debate. But what I can say is, instead of focusing to say why did the Americans pass, we also have to introspect to say why, to say was that legitimate or not.
Let us ask Dewa, who is working for an NGO that is based in America.
Well, yes, the thing is, when you look at the American sanctions under ZIDERA on Zimbabwe, primarily the target is President Mugabe and his inner circle of about 200 individuals, and also a prohibition of selling of arms to Zimbabwe, to the military, which was a sign of displeasure by the Americans in terms of the lack of democracy and human rights in Zimbabwe, which was to say, if you push for certain reforms, then we would remove these smart sanctions. So it simply meant that Mugabe and his wife could not freely go across the US shopping as they used to do, or to London and other places.
They go to Southeast Asia.
Yes, so now they go to Singapore and Dubai. But in New York, if they
come
go
to Johannesburg.
Oh yes, and also cause problems. So it was really about targeting individuals to apply pressure, which is actually important. And the biggest challenge in terms of the Zimbabwean economy is not ZIDERA or anyone outside. It's not external. It's internal to Zimbabwe. where you have a cabinet that seeks to discuss factions or personalities and not the development of Zimbabwe.
The question I want to ask, Mr. Karombo, is what do the Zimbabweans in the diaspora say? What do they do? And what should they do?
I think as Zimbabweans, our only country is Zimbabwe. So I, for one, I believe as Zimbabweans in the diaspora, they should also put their resources and their monies back to Zimbabwe so that they can build the economy, which is now almost in ruins.
What brought the economy to ruins?
Well, there are several factors that brought the economy to ruins. If you look, I can say, Mr. Dewa, forget to tell us that Zidera, it was not only on targeted people, because if you look companies like Agribank is not about people. It's an agricultural bank. It was also on Zidera, and it was not.
It belongs to the state.
Yes, though it belongs to the state, but it was not transacting with any other country besides Zimbabwe, of which besides Agribank, there are other simple companies which also were on the list of Zidera, which were stifled of their way to do their business outside the country. So to say that it was also targeted, I tend to differ with you, Mr. Dewa.
The other question, of course, is what can SADC do? What can South Africa do? What can other countries do around Zimbabwe?
I think what SADC can do, in particular South Africa, what they can do around Zimbabwe is to try and leverage.
I was saying, in particular, South Africa, the chairman of SADC is now.
Yeah, the chairman. I mean, the chairship of SADC is now with South Africa, and also on the basis that South Africa, no doubt, is the biggest economy in SADC, and also it's a major influencer, and it has also been carrying much of the Zimbabwean burden ever since the Zimbabwean crisis spilled outside of its national borders. So I think there's something which needs to be done. But in particular, I think what is needed is particularly for Zimbabwe to follow the SADC principles and guidelines, particularly on conducting elections. If you look at this 2018 election which is coming, and as well to make sure that, they make the colleagues in Zimbabwe understand that what they need to do is to follow the constitution, the spirit of the law, and implement it in total, not in bits and pieces, or when it suits them, then they think that they can act lawfully. But when it doesn't, then they seek to circumvent the law. I think this is where SADC needs to put a red line.
Recently, 2 weeks ago, Zimbabwe started a biometric system to register voters for the 2018 votes. Did you guys vote? Did you register?
I actually tried to register. I was in Zimbabwe a week ago, but I failed to, and I still have to go back again because so far they've managed to register. It's about 10,000 people, and when you look at the time which they are taking to register, the number of people which they are registering per week, and you look at the times which are promulgated, it means with the current voters, estimated voters of 7 million, would need 14 years to register at the current rate.
No, but you are looking only on the ballot kits, which, the VR kits which have been brought now. On the 15th or 16th of this month, there will be also 2,600 kits which are coming. So I think that will make the process a bit faster. Personally, I've registered, and I'll go back, and during the time of voting, I'll go back and vote.
Yep, and I would support the call that Zimbabweans in the diaspora and at home should register to vote. And South Africa should press Zimbabwe, and SADC should press Zimbabwe for a credible, free and fair election. Because the challenge is not only about the people who vote, but also those who count the votes.
By the way, the Zimbabweans who are staying outside of Zimbabwe, who are outside of Zimbabwe during the elections, cannot vote unless they are in Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
That's correct.
Yes,
that's correct.
Unlike South Africa, where you can vote if you are in England.
No, there are no postal votes for any individual except maybe people from the army, isn't it?
Yes, but the constitution actually allows for the diaspora vote, but we have not been granted by the Electoral Commission. So that is one other point that we're pushing for, that the diaspora should be allowed to vote from where they are, because it is a right of a Zimbabwean citizen in the diaspora to vote, but there is a perception that those in the diaspora are opposition, and therefore there is no need to extend the vote to them. But it's a fundamental right that must be granted.
To what extent does, I read this morning that Mr. Morgan Shangarai has been discharged from hospital. To what extent did that dent this coalition they are trying to form?
Certainly, okay, before I get into that question, I just wanted to remind also Mr. Makarom that the diasporas are playing a role, because like last year, they contributed close to $1 billion in terms of remittances. And this is like almost 25% of Zimbabwe's GDP. So I think the diaspora, this is official. We haven't yet talked of unofficial remittance in terms of goods, services, cars, and so forth. So if you look at the contribution of this diaspora, it has been tremendous. Otherwise, Zimbabwe would have been grounded on its knees, because as it stands, it produces nothing after the destruction of its economy. But then going to the issue which you have raised of Morgan, certainly it did create some challenges, particularly for the issues of around the coalition, because even when you look at the coalition on its own, the fact that the coalition was facing resistance when you look at it. So even within his party as MDCT, there were actual convulsions around whether to go the coalition or not by certain, by also some certain sections who feel that their interests maybe are not being taken care of. But then even if you look what happened after what transpired, already we have the other party considered, like the PDP, the People's Democratic Party, is now already under split, and one of the issue is not to go into the coalition. So basically, I think Mr. Changrai's health is weighing
Mr. Karombo, there seems to be a push to get Mr. Emerson Mnangagwa out of the way. And there's a strong push for the First Lady to come in and become a contender in 2018.
I think that is the talk in the media. In reality, there is nothing like that. Mr. Mnangagwa, as we know, is still the Vice President of Zimbabwe, and he will remain as the Vice President for now. And he was only appointed by the President to be his assistant. It's not automatic that because you're a Vice President, in future will be the President.
No, but he was given a chance to stay, and it looks like he's being pushed aside.
No, he has not been pushed aside. He's still there. And I can tell you, I don't foresee the First Lady being the President of Zimbabwe. Mugabe himself said he cannot tweak the Constitution to appoint his wife. He said it. He said he would follow the Constitution, the latter.
Yeah. I think the challenge is actually a reflection of how President Mugabe operates, because it shows that even within his party's PF, there is no rule of law. Everything, the power is concentrated in his person. And that is the challenge. That is why we see now Mnangagwa being pushed aside. And yes, the First Lady does have ambitions. It would not be good for democracy for her to ascend, but certainly there are people who are pushing her to that position, and she believes, she has said herself publicly, that who more than Grace Mugabe has a right to become the next president. She has said that publicly.
The person who must have had a very difficult job, who still has that very difficult job, is the Minister of Finance.
Yes, certainly. The Minister of Finance has got a difficult job because he is presiding over a treasury whose leader of whose president doesn't believe in any in any sound financial management principle. What he's actually mostly driven by is about power, the retention of power at all costs, even if it means destroying the economy. So I don't see how Minister Chinamasa's work is going to be easy, or for anyone else who would come in. They will always be in trouble, because remember when he tried to introduce some austerity and he suspended the civil servants' bonuses because the treasurer was facing some issues. He was just overruled at a rally, and immediately 2 months after that we started facing
just before we're quickly running out of time, Dewa and Mr. Karombo, President Mugabe is coming to South Africa. He's leading a delegation to South Africa to come and talk about the bilateral commission between South Africa and Zimbabwe. What must take place? If you were to be part of that delegation, what would you press for?
Well, the first thing is that Zimbabwe should have considered the use of the South African rand as the official currency, because there is no currency. There is a serious cash shortage in Zimbabwe. But the challenge with Mugabe is delegation to South Africa is that the main focus is that it will be the extended family. It will be people who are coming for shopping in Johannesburg and not serious economists, and there is no fiscal discipline in the ZANU-PF government. So these are the big challenges.
Luke Zunga says in his book that some of the ministers are not prudent with the way they deal with their department's budgets.
Absolutely agreed. Luke Zunga is spot on that issue, yes.
Mr. Karombo, clear final word for you.
I think since the president coming here, I expect more bilateral talks in terms of trade, where they should be...
What would you want if you were in that delegation?
Well, I don't think the issue of Zimbabwe taking rand is an option. Maybe loans. We would expect maybe to talk of what loans that they can give to Zimbabwe for some time. Then
so you are telling us President Mugabe is coming with a begging bowl?
Yes.
Let me give the final word to Mr. Sherman Boa.
Yes, I would say let's not expect so much, but if I were part of that delegation, if I had the power to influence, one thing which I would actually talk about is the issue of the lines of credit, which he has talked about, and as well to say, as Zimbabwe, what can be done, particularly in terms of issues of investment, particular protection of investment, because investors, they don't just come and just put their money in a ditch. They expect that when they bring in their money into Zimbabwe, what will happen to that money? Will that money be safe or not? And we have quite a number of South African investments which have faced problems in Zimbabwe. So I think those are some of the issues which I expect the Zimbabwe delegations would be able to articulate to the South Africans and give them assurance and actually tangible, tangible proposal on how investment can be safeguarded.
Well, we'll continue to be talking about Zimbabwe until the 2018 elections. We'll be following those very closely. This program is repeated at 5 on Monday morning from all of us in the studio. Thank you to our guests and goodbye.
Commissioner by National Commission.